Resumes. Mr. White, you're still under oath. Mr. Smith.
I was saying, Mr. White, that on the one hand, the desire to have those who are armed arrested existed. But you can accept as a legitimate concern of the police that it was also necessary to disarm them sooner to curb the potential of further killings.
That's always going to be a consideration. However, I think it's worthy of note the comments that Mr. Scott makes with regards to the fact that since the plan had went into operation, that no violence had taken place.
If it is enough to say yes, please. I have time constraints. I haven't asked you about Mr. Scott, but you're taking me there.
But you're asking me for my opinion in relation to whether or not it would be better to arrest people sooner rather than later. Now, if I'm going to give you my opinion, Mr. Semenya, then please, I need to give you my whole opinion. It's not sufficient for me simply to say yes or no without an explanation. None of these things are absolute. All of these things happen in a context, and the issue is around proportionality, around actions. So I think it is only fair to say, of course, if the police could have got those weapons off people earlier rather than later, then the potential for those weapons to be used for further acts of violence stops, of course. However, it's about the consequence of actually moving in to take those weapons. What that leads to is the issue, and that needs to be factored in advance. And my point is that Colonel Scott himself had actually made the comment that the plan appeared to be working in terms of negotiation, and therefore there was an absence of violence for a period of 48 hours from the Tuesday afternoon up until the period when the operation went tactical. And the violence that you referred to in terms of the burning of the vehicles then happened subsequent to that. I think it's only fair that I can give that full answer.
Page 75. At the top of the page, you talk about one of the options being to maintain stage 2.
Indeed.
For how long?
Well, again, that's an open question. It depends upon what else is happening. So, for example, the issues that you referred to earlier on about, is it possible to get Londoners to step up to their responsibilities about potentially coming to the copy or whatever other negotiations can take place? But the point is that stage 1 and stage 2 had effectively brought a temporary, potentially, halt to the violence. I think that's a success.
So you can't tell us how long stage 2 reasonably ought to have been maintained beyond the duration that it was maintained?
No, but I did give a suggestion, again, based on Colonel Scott's own interpretation of the facts, that potentially you could have then taken an alternative course of action, say, for example, on the morning of the 17th.
And you say that there was also an opportunity perhaps to re-engage negotiations. Do you have any evidence indicating a possibility that London was going to change his position?
No, I don't, nor do I have any evidence to suggest they wouldn't.
Sorry?
Nor do I have any evidence to suggest that they wouldn't. You know, in negotiations, things change. Sometimes people maintain a position for a long period of time. Sometimes they change. I mean, that's the nature of negotiation.
No, but we know the evidence, Mr. White. We know there have been attempts at getting Lonmin from day one to go to the copy, and they steadfastly said they're not going there. Can't we accept that to have maintained?
Well, I will accept that they haven't gone there, and if it helped you, I'm prepared to accept that they won't go there, but I don't know how I would know that.
And you accept that Mr. Matunjo had resigned to the fact that the strikers were not going to listen to him to disarm?
Well, I understand he addressed the strikers, and then, as you described, he drove off. But also my understanding of the evidence is that even prior to him driving off, a number of people, quite a considerable number, were seen to be leaving the copy.
Even the presence of Bishop Seoka doesn't seem to have gotten them to disarm?
That's correct.
Okay. On page 76. In 656, small letter A, you say, you criticize Major General Mpembe saying that the negotiations had failed. You say it is probably more accurate to say that the negotiations had stabilized the situation but had not resolved it. What's the distinction you're drawing there?
The point that I'm making is about the negotiations between the police, Mr. McIntosh, Mr. Callitz, and the crowd. The fact that, as has been already sort of evidence has been given, there were a number of murders in the preceding days. The negotiations, stage 1, stage 2, if you like, combined, go into effect on the Tuesday afternoon, and for the period of almost 48 hours before stage 3 go tactical. There hasn't been any other notable violence. So my point is that actually that's the negotiations that I'm referring to, where Mr. McIntosh and Mr. Callitz are engaging with the crowd, and that seems to have stabilised the position.
And in paragraph 6.5.6, little letter C, which appears on page 77, you say because of threats made to police at the time, there would have had to be attempts to redouble the attempts to avoid rather than to seek conflict. Are you saying the decision to go tactical was a decision seeking conflict?
No.
Okay.
My point is, and I use the word circumspection, there has been evidence given of threats being issued by, I think, Mr. Nocky and that group to Mr. McIntosh and Mr. Callitz. I think those happened on Thursday, and I think if I'm correct, Chair, they also happened on the Wednesday. And my point is that even I referred to Mr. Marafe's oral evidence yesterday, where he says where a crowd's seeking confrontation, it's perhaps not the best time to intervene. So the point in that paragraph is basically just saying that as we look at this situation in its entirety, if those threats are being made, that maybe sort of gives an indication of at least the attitude within some part of the crowd. That is there further cause for some degree of circumspection in relation to the police. Because do we move in now and inflame that situation, or can we stand back and see basically what's going to happen to potentially allow the situation to calm down again, based on these threats that are allegedly being made?
And the number 50 appearing at on page 78, paragraph 6.5.9, approximately 50 people there. That is copy 1, am I right?
That's correct, yes.
Page 79. In paragraph 6.5.12, you say, fourthly, there is nothing in the contemporaneous plans to indicate an appreciation of the smaller militant group as a separate specific threat. The evidence, as I understand it, is the police knew there were distinct groups on the copy, the one bigger group on the top of the copy and a smaller one that was there. Is that the evidence that you also
and I've seen evidence
came across?
Mr. Semenya, I agree with you, and I've seen evidence to that fact as well. However, when I wrote this statement, the evidence that I was engaging with, and principally around that paragraph, the evidence of the Chief Planner, Lieutenant Colonel Scott, actually doesn't make that separation. And that's why that paragraph's in there. I've subsequently seen evidence, oral evidence from police officers who will come and talk about the difference around the smaller group. But again, as I made the point to you earlier on, you've got to look at this, my statement in the context of when it was written and the evidence that I'd been able to engage with at that time. And largely that paragraph was around the statement of Mr. Scott, who's compiling the plan.
That's really a factual dispute that we have to resolve, isn't it? I mean, we've got to decide, it's one of the issues before us, so whether at all times they were intending essentially to deal in the main with what I call the militant group, whether their plans at all times involved dealing with all 3,000 as one, as it were. There is conflicting evidence on the point, but we'll have to decide on that point what our finding is. It's not really a matter for your expert evidence, is it?
No, Chair, and that's why hopefully my clarification is helpful in the sense that that paragraph dealt with the evidence that was in front of me then in engaging with Mr. Scott's statement.
Page 80. In paragraph 6.5.14, you deal with the question of positive attraction. You are now familiar with the fact that Mr. Noki was leading the group home, as they say, did not live in Nkane.
I'm not aware of where Mr. Noki lives.
And as I understand the question of positive and negative attraction is if, for whatever reason, you find the need to protect a vital asset, that would make it a negative attraction point by definition.
As I understand, the definition of positive and attraction point relates to whether or not it's an area that a crowd would ordinarily want to go to or not. And this was a matter of dispute between myself and the SABC legal team and some of the correspondence. The definition that I rely on in relation to what positive attraction means, as I've just explained to you, Mr. Chairman, isn't my definition, it's the definition from the SABC documentation. It's a point where the crowd are likely to move to. The purpose in identifying positive and negative attraction points is understanding what you think the crowd might do. Now, a positive attraction point for the crowd might be somewhere that you really, really don't want them to go for a very good reason. And therefore, then you need to put measures in place to stop them from going there. But it's still a positive attraction point for the crowd in so much as that's where they want to go. You have to stop them. That's the issue in relation to positive and negative attraction points. Similarly, if there's a particular strategic issue that you want to defend, a utility plant or something, again, then you need to protect that. That might be a positive attraction point for the crowd, or it might not be. But that's the definition of positive and negative attraction, again, coming from SABC documents, not my own interpretation. But it's an interpretation I happen to agree with.
I was very careful in formulating my question, Mr. White, that a negative attraction point would be a point where you don't want people to go because of some strategic reason. That would make it a negative attraction point. Is that something you cannot accord with?
No, I can agree with that.
In page 85. Paragraph 6.5.20, that really is hindsight you're talking there, Mr. White, is it not?
Chairman, I don't think it's hindsight at all. And in fact, in the previous 3 pages of my statement, we actually produce images in order to help explain this point. If you look at the original, sorry, Chair, I was just letting you finish. If you look at the original configuration of the barbed wire as planned by Mr. Scott, it suggests to people, we don't want you to come this way. There's the arc right across. For I'm sure very good reasons, Nyala 6 got moved. So instead of it being an arc, I apologise for the transcript, instead of it being an arc which almost sort of protected the informal settlement and seemed to me to be suggesting to people, the police don't want you to come this way, it then became more of an L shape, which actually seemed to suggest, I would have thought to people that, well, they could go there. Now, I don't think that's with the benefit of hindsight. I think if you look at those three images, I think that's an entirely logical conclusion. So no, it's not with the benefit of hindsight.
You're not critical of the decision to move Nyala 6 because of a perceived threat that it's isolated and could be subject of attack?
If that was the case, then to be honest with you, I would applaud the decision to move it.
Page 86.
Sorry, can I just put a point before you move on? It won't take too much of time. Once they moved Nyala 6, there was, as it were, the gap which the strikers, it could be said, were trying to take, namely the position at the other side of the kraal where there was an opening for them to get through. As far as my recollection goes, they hadn't, in fact, used Nyala 5, because Nyala 4 went all the way to the one side of the kraal. So if they wanted to continue the idea of a block, or a barrier, is the right word, a barrier between the strikers and the informal settlement, they would then have had to use, or they could have used, presumably, in Nyala 5 to close the gap that was left on the other side of the kraal. Is that essentially what you're saying?
That's would be my interpretation, Chair. But of course, the fact that that didn't happen, and of course the crowd were already considerable numbers of them moving, even as Nyala 1 and Nyala 2 were moving. So basically, what we saw was lots of the protesters who were moving down that road, which actually runs alongside of the kraal, long before Nyala 4 had ever got there with the wire. So basically, not only did that effective L shape of the way the police vehicles potentially would have been set out, that would have nearly suggested to people they could go that way. And of course, that's the way a lot of people went. Forget about even the more militant group that we're referring to, but lots of people left the copy beforehand and walked that exact route.
But clearly, if they had done what the chairman suggests was possible, there would be no dispersal action because the police would be this side of that enclosure, entirely enclosed by the barbed wire.
Well, of course, this was one of the issues I sort of was confused about in relation to the plan because, as you say, Chair, Nyala 5 could have been used to extend on beyond Nyala 4. Well, the original plan was that is what was to happen, and then Nyala 6 beyond that. So in some respects, when they created that wire in order to create this sort of neutral zone, this area where police officers and media and whatever would be safe, it was somewhat confusing to me. Well, how actually would the dispersal resources get out? Because they're now behind the wire. Because the sequencing of the plan was the wire goes out, then at a time of Mr. Callitz as the operational commander choosing, he gives this warning to the crowd. He then allows people to leave, and then the dispersal action takes place. And it was always a matter of confusion to me. Well, surely the dispersal resources are now stuck behind the wire.
The original plan didn't envisage a gap. It envisaged an uninterrupted barrier. Presumably, I think we asked Colonel Scott at the time, but I take it the answer would have been, well, once they were ready to go into the area where the strikers were, they could have effected some kind of temporary gap in the barrier they'd created to go through. I mean,
that may well have been the case.
Have you because
Somewhere
Andrew Hedlund says I've got it wrong, that in fact they were going to go around the end of the barrier and through in an arc. But anyway, I don't think anything turns on the point. Let me not waste Mr. Semenya's time further.
Somewhere in your report you deal with the use of the words bloodshed by General Mpembe in one of the meetings. The evidence by General Mpembe is that he used that expression in attempts to pressure Lonmin to appreciate the need to resolve the industrial dispute. That's the context.
I accept that.
If your report is read to read that it was because of some foreseeable loss of life in stage 3, we should decontextualize that, correct?
In order to give you a brief answer, Mr. Semenya, as you've asked me to, could you rephrase the question, because I don't quite follow?
You are not connoting in reference to that utterance that he was foreseeing stage 3 culminating in bloodshed.
If you're asking me, did I think that he felt that he was planning for bloodshed? No. However, I took that comment to be that he was trying to negotiate, as we referred to earlier on. He was trying to make Lonmans or the unions realise that, look, this is the potential seriousness of this, and therefore, that's part of his negotiation strategy. However, the point that he makes is he uses the word bloodshed, and he basically, it seems to me that he's saying, given the number of people on that hill and they're heavily armed, if I then have to send in lots of heavily armed police, there's likely to be bloodshed.
Now you're building those words into his mouth. I'm telling you what he said in his evidence.
Well, with respect then, Mr. Semenya, if I'm incorrectly quoting him, if you want to put the exact words up, and I'll engage with those. But my only point in relation to this is Mr. Mpembe appeared to be alive to the fact that this potentially could be a very difficult, dangerous situation involving violence the following day, where you have to put heavily armed police officers into confrontation with a heavily armed group. And he was trying to use that in order to influence people to see if we can negotiate our way out of this. I get that. But the point is that I use that reference then to make the point that Mr. Mpembe is alive to the high-risk nature of this operation. And yet, the following day, they went ahead with and did exactly that. That's my point. But if I've misquoted him, I'm more than happy to see it on the screen and to engage with the specifics of what he said.
Page 89. Where you make reference to snipers in paragraph 6.5.31, small letter A, you're not suggesting, if we accepted that the crowd that moved to the TRT line, if the evidence is that they were acting in concert, that it is a situation that could have been resolved by appointment of snipers. That's not what you're suggesting there.
I make the reference to snipers because snipers were placed, and as I understand, snipers were placed on the basis of there is intelligence to say that there may be firearms threat against the police, and that firearms have been stolen throughout the course of the week, and we know that they've been used. So I make that point that snipers are already sort of deployed in this. I then go on to make the further point that when you're engaging with a firearms threat in relation to a crowd, there are ways to do that respectfully, and ways to do it in a way that doesn't involve lining up 60 people armed with rifles who are all going to potentially perceive and engage the same threat. That's I think the point that I'm making.
The question is a simple one. You're not suggesting, and if you are, tell me, you're not suggesting that that problem could have been resolved by the use of snipers.
No, I'm not, but I would refer to the last couple of lines of that. In my experience, It is generally not sufficient when firearms can be anticipated in a crowd situation to leave the response to officer discretion, acting in self or private defence. It's also unfair to the officers to be placed in that situation. That's the point that I'm making around this issue of the line of TRT officers.
The question really is, what's the solution? I can understand you don't like 60 members of the police force, police service, each of whom has got an R5, each of whom is given the authority, if he considers it necessary, to defend himself or his colleagues, to fire. So then you have potentially 60 shotters all firing at once on the advancing group. That obviously you don't like, and that you suggested that's undesirable, inappropriate. What would be an appropriate way of dealing with the matter? What Mr. Semenya is suggesting to you is just having two or three snipers wouldn't be enough, and I take it you agree with that. So what was the alternative?
Well, Chair, I actually have given evidence in my statement. Maybe somebody can help me with specific reference where I've talked about dealing with that type of eventuality in a crowd situation. I've experience of it. I think I gave evidence in my evidence in chief around it, where we would have used specialist armed response officers, especially trained firearms officers, if you like, embedded within the public order units.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think you're referring to, in your report, 7.5.11 on page 115.
So you, Mr. Watt, are suggesting dedicated officers who would be responsible for dealing with that issue, rather than a line of 60.
Yes, Commissioner, yes, that's exactly my point.
That's effectively what you say in 7.5.11.
And I'm grateful that is indeed the
well,
reference.
Just check.
It is indeed, Chair.
What did you say? Now, guys, you have to be with me. Huh? You have.
Just it arises is, the point you make in 7.5.11, maximum lethal force be used only when necessary, avoid the use of force at all costs. Linked to that would be the necessity, when force has to be used, to use as little force as possible. And giving 60 people R5s and saying, all of you can shoot as and when you consider necessary to defend yourselves and your colleagues, it might well be argued, I'm not making up, saying what the answer is, but it might well be argued that would not be using as little force as possible. The question, would you agree with that?
That's exactly my point, Chair.
Then the next question that arises, which I think you can legitimately be asked, is what would be as little force as possible? And I take it your answer is contained in this paragraph. Am I understanding you correctly?
Exactly. I mean, the issue in relation to use of force is that it's in proportion. So it's about understanding what the threat actually is that you're facing, and then trying to work out a tactical option to deal with that. And I've been consistent in all three of my statements. One of my main issues here is that the tactical configuration of how the operation was set up was likely to lead to higher uses of force. That's not with the benefit of hindsight. I couldn't understand why during the planning process, during the meeting that we were talking about before the tea break, the 30-minute meeting, that senior police officers were not objecting to this plan on that basis.
May I just understand, given the circumstances as they were on the 16th, when the numbers involved, and if you were suggesting the dedicated, you call them firearms officers, do you? How many would you say would be given that order to deal with the threat?
Well, again, this comes back to careful planning. So it's about understanding what that threat is. By way of example, it may well be that you have potentially 3 or 4 public order teams who are going to engage a crowd, and it may well be that at this end of the crowd, for whatever reason, based on the intelligence, we don't anticipate a firearms threat or a threat where potentially there is a threat to life of whatever sort, maybe not necessarily by firearms. Whereas over here, there is. Now, again, none of this stuff is perfect science. It's about trying to interpret the risks and responding to that. So it may well be that, as I say, we would have embedded on either end of a public order line police officers who are specifically trained to carry out that function. And ordinarily it would be one person with a gun with their backup team, as in spotters, people to help them identify the threat. Also, what you would configure into that would be about the protection that can be afforded from various vehicles. If there is a specific firearms threat that police officers are facing, and that's based on very good and reliable intelligence, it may even be that in dealing with a crowd, a public order crowd, we confine police officers to their vehicles. We actually use vehicle tactics because it's too dangerous for them to get out. So rather than get out and being exposed and therefore have to shoot back, we might keep them in vehicles. So my answer to you, Commissioner, is basically that it depends on the threat. You plan around the threat, but in a way that is likely to minimise the use of force.
But given the circumstances, as you're fully aware of the 16th, what would you suggest? How many dedicated firearms officers would you have to deal with this threat? That's really what I'm trying to understand, because you don't like the 60 people. So what are you suggesting would be appropriate?
Well, I would suggest a number considerably lower than that. We could perhaps be here all day as to whether or not it's 5, it's 10, or it's 3 or 4. But the point that I think I made yesterday actually is that given the nature of the threat, and I understand there was a firearms threat, and then there was an actual firearms incident within this. That's what the evidence is. But I did talk about yesterday that I think that for the most part, this crowd who are armed largely with what are referred to as traditional dangerous weapons could have been dealt with fairly adequately with the range of less lethal options had they been properly used.
Well, let's just go back to the firearm with the what I call the shotists that you'd have. I'm not sure whether shotist is the right word, but I don't know a more appropriate one. And my understanding you to be saying is what should perhaps have happened was there should have been an Inyala at either end, parked as it were, at either end of the line, and in which there were officers armed with R5s or with rifles anyway, and with spotters assisting them. They could then have fired through from the Inyala at the advancing group, be relatively safe themselves because they'd be in the Inyala. Is that what you're saying? I don't quite understand what you're saying. You did say, see, this is leads to a debate with my colleague. I understood you to say initially, effectively snipers at each side, one on each side of the line, assisted by spotters and so on. But you also then spoke about the necessity for them possibly to be protected by being in armoured vehicles, which made me think that you were suggesting that perhaps they should be in Inyala. But I think we should get clarity on what you say the police should have done, because you are saying there's a defect in their plan. I know your first point is that they shouldn't have endeavoured to exercise the tactical option on the Thursday. They should have done it early morning on the Friday. But that, in the alternatives, as it were, what was wrong with the actual plan that was implemented on the Thursday? You say that 60 people with firearms at discretion to fire is inappropriate. What is the alternative? If you can spell that out with precision, because I think that's important for us, and I suspect for Mr. Semenya too.
Chair, three points on what you said. First of all, the reference to snipers. When I talk about use of firearms teams in a public order operation, I'm not necessarily talking about snipers, certainly the way Mr. Fritz had described them. I think those were people who were nearly, I think they're STF personnel, and they were placed sort of almost independent of the dispersal to provide for protection against the specific firearms threat. So they're deployed and set them aside. Then, looking at the circumstances of Marikana, we are talking about a dispersal operation whereby public order police are going forward to disperse a crowd who are armed with dangerous traditional weapons, but also our intelligence suggests that there may be firearms threat within that. Okay, so because don't forget, this is the planning. This is what we anticipated was going to happen. So therefore, to engage that threat, and there are potentially small numbers of firearms within that crowd, then how do you do that? And what I've given you evidence of is I've faced that type of a situation before, and what we've done is, as the public order, as the POPs line have gone forward, they're maybe accompanied on either end, either extremity of that line, by armed response officers, specifically firearms trained officers trained to do that particular job. who would also have practiced with the public order teams in terms of training and whatever. So maybe one at either end of the public order team.
They would be on foot, in other words. They wouldn't be in armoured vehicles.
Potentially they would be on foot. And the third point that I was going to make was that then your reference, if it clears up any confusion, I talked about people in armoured vehicles. On occasions I've faced circumstances whereby the level of threat, the level of intelligence, if you like, is such that we have to be in a particular area, because quite often the difficulties that we deal with is around two opposing communities. So it's not an available option for the police not to be there, or potentially life could be lost. So the police might have to be between these two opposing communities. But if the threat level is such that there is intelligence suggesting that actually there could be lots of firearms, there could be AK-47s, etc. in the air, then rather than putting police officers out on a shield line to simply walk forward towards that crowd, it may well be that we actually utilise armoured vehicles. In other words, we manage the crowd by vehicle tactics, by not getting the police officers out of the vehicles because it's too dangerous to do so.
Thank you, I understand. Thank you, I understand.
Mr. White, I thought we had agreed that the possibility of the crowd moving around the corner, as they did, was not present at the 1430 JOCOM discussion.
And I thought I was careful in my answer to the chairman, where I actually said how this was planned, and the example I gave was how this was planned was that the POP dispersal line would be moving forward. So I was given an illustrative example based on what the plan was, not that people came around the crowd.
And that the TRT only moved there once they saw the crowd moving around the corner. That's what happened. And they realized they would be going into the, in quotes, the safe area where there were media and other people.
That may be so, but my criticism is around the TRT in this line. And the plan from the outset was that the POP officers would go forward and disperse, and they would be supported by this TRT line of 60 people. That was the plan. As you say, the TRT came forward when people went around the crowd. But in terms of my criticism of the planning was that the TRT, 60 people, would be lined up to follow the POP.
I think your line of argument, Mr. White, with respect, implicitly rejects that the shooting was a function of self-defense as opposed to a police operational plan to do something.
I'm not sure that's correct, and I've always been careful, Chair, to say that obviously I'm very aware of my position here. It's your position to decide factually what happened. I'm just trying to give you an interpretation of the facts based on my opinion as to potentially what might have happened or could have happened. So if I am overstepping my mark in that regard with regards to what Mr. Semenya says there, I apologise to you. I'm sure you'll comment on that.
What I also find difficult, and please help me, where Standing Order 262 says in Clause 11 that things like putting a barbed wire is defensive action, requires no prior announcement, you're saying it does.
I'm saying that it is, I think, fairly well accepted, good public order policing, dealing with crowds, principles, that when the police are carrying out actions, they provide warnings to the crowds. Now, if there is a specific direction in relation to 262 or elsewhere that says that you shouldn't do that for whatever reason, well, that's fine. I'm saying to you, Chair, as someone who has considerable experience of dealing with public order, that and looking at some of the learning, if you like, coming out of reviews of public order situations, that actually it is generally accepted as good practice in managing crowds that we use this concept of no surprises, where we keep the crowd informed of what's going to happen, so that there can't be a misinterpretation of the actions of police.
But let's explore that. If the tactic is, for instance, we are going to channel this group using vehicles, blocking that and blocking that, do you announce that in advance?
Sorry?
If you're going to do a channeling exercise, channeling crowds. You're going to be using vehicles to block this entrance, to open that entrance, and to block the other. Do you announce that to the crowd in advance, that you are going to be channeling,
As you said, Mr. Semenya, there is a responsibility on the police to engage with the stakeholders. We talked about that at length. And the planning of these operations would often involve lots of engagement with stakeholders, including representatives of communities, where we make it very clear as to...
No, I'm talking about spontaneous events. Obviously, if it is planned, everybody agrees. I'm talking about spontaneous ones.
When
Do you
police,
tell? Sorry?
And then in relation to spontaneous events, where the police are taking actions, yes, it would be, as a matter of course, the police would explain that. We give warnings in relation to any use of force whatsoever, because the idea behind a warning is that hopefully people will acknowledge, understand that warning, and desist from what they're doing, resulting in the police not having to use force. That's exactly within the principle of the minimum use of force. So warnings repeated again and again and again, if necessary, can often result in not actually having to use the force that you're warning for in the first place.
In any event, you're familiar with the evidence that Brigadier Khalid's explained to Mr. You talk about best practice. By that, I understand you to use the phrase in reference to at least the minimum that you expect in public order police operations. No?
I want to help you, Mr. Semenya, if you could rephrase your question on the basis that I don't see anywhere that I've used the word minimum here. I'm not sure what your question is. I apologize.
In the middle of that paragraph, you say, unless you are properly trained in what is considered as best practice, you can never be sure if your experience is still relevant. Is that a reference to minimum standards, which you call best practice, or not?
I think if you look at in the paragraph in its entirety, I'm sort of making the point that I made that many of the senior leadership had no up-to-date public order training, and the point is made that these are highly experienced officers. Being experienced is very useful, very, very important, but actually continuous professional development is also very important as well. So experience of itself, I think, is not sufficient. Ongoing training, things change. Not least even the law changes. In the last time I was here and we were given evidence, we looked at a number of reports by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, learning from different events. So if you only base your approach to these things on your own personal experience, then I think, to be honest with you, there's a flaw in that, and it should be complemented by ongoing training. That's my point.
In your report, you are critical about the use of Colonel Farlam radio language, that it was not helpful. It could have been better.
Yes, I do.
Where you say on page 110 that failure to communicate the barbed wire would have caused fear and confusion, is it based on any previous occurrence?
Well, I think that point is basically going back to this issue that I've talked about before, no surprises. When barbed wire is starting to be rolled out, then actually people may not understand what that's for, and they might misinterpret what it's for. I mean, there's actually evidence to suggest that police officers misinterpreted what it was for. So I'm sure similarly the crowd could be expected to do the same.
With the time constraints, you do accept, don't you, Mr. White, that the question whether the response by the SAP in relation to what was the attack or what they would have perceived to be an attack was excessive or not is ultimately a question to be answered by the Commission, right?
Absolutely.
And your opinion on the matter would be inadmissible for that reason?
Well, I think that's a matter for the Chair.
Yeah, you can ask a witness for his opinion on whether his opinion is relevant or not. If he's got expertise in the field and he knows from his experience what would be excessive or not non-excessive response, I take it he can give evidence on that. If he's in a better, the test for expert evidence and opinion is whether the witness is in a better position than the triers of fact because of his experience or learning or whatever, then he can give the opinion. The question is whether this witness is in such a position. And I don't know whether he's qualified to decide that or not. But perhaps I can ask you, have you got experience which enables you to express an opinion, an informed opinion, which would be of assistance to what is excessive force as opposed to non-excessive force? Or is it something that could safely be left to the triers of fact?
Well, Chair, I've set out my considerations at some considerable length in my statements, particularly the final statement, and therefore I think that's for you to decide. I've also been open and honest with regards to my experience in relation to the actual use of firearms, in that I'm a gold firearms trained commander, or was when I was a police officer, so I have lots of experience of commanding what we call firearms incidents. I have limited experience with regards to actually commanding operations where the police have fired weapons, fortunately so, because we do that very rarely. So I've set out my considerations. I'm also I like to say, have a significant amount of experience at engaging with planning processes based on principles of minimum use of force and proportionality. And therefore I respectfully offer up my opinions in regard to the issues around the use of firearms. And obviously it's entirely up to a matter for yourself, Sharon, as to whether or not you wish to accept those.
Well, we'll argue at the right point whether or not you can answer the ultimate question charged this commission, but given the time constraints, Chair, I must stop my cross-examination here.
It's the end of your cross-examination. Yes. Re-examination, Mr. Roux?
No, we agreed there's no re-examination, Chair. We agreed there's no re-examination.
No re-examination.
Well, it's on paper,
It's on paper.
as we understand the expert process.
Yes, I see. This is the end of Mr. White's evidence. Well, Mr. White, thank you for coming back and giving us your evidence. I have to say the usual thing, that if it's necessary for us to get you back, which I don't think is likely, but anything is possible, you will come back without having to send a subpoena to Dublin or wherever you will be.
Of course, Chair.
Thank you. On that basis, you're excused. Thank you. Appropriate for us now to take procedure, and I was proposing to take it a bit later, but probably more convenient for us to take it now. We must try to stick to quarter of an hour because I know we try often and don't succeed, but this time we must succeed because time is very precious.